In case you didn't know somehow, I'm pretty fond of Tailwind. It wasn't always that way though. When I first saw it, I had the same gut reaction most of the haters do. It seemed like a terrible way to ruin your HTML and make your CSS harder to build and maintain. And I, like many of those people, was very, very wrong. All of that said, there are some problems with Tailwind, and there's one person in particular I actually trust to give us this information. His name is Naman. He's the creator of StyleX, and if you've seen my coverage of StyleX, you might know how much I respect him and the work he's doing to make really, really good, performant, and safe methods for styling your applications. And it's not some crazy theoretical stuff either. It's what Meta uses for all of their styling across their apps nowadays. He knows his stuff, and I've had a video planned for a while where I was going to go in depth on his handful of small but meaningful critiques of Tailwind. But I haven't gotten to it because you've seen the schedule. I'm busy. But now I have a reason to. A very, very fun reason. Naman put up a blog post, his thoughts on Tailwind 4. And for the most part, they are very good thoughts. But there is one big thing he's concerned about. And I think it is worth all of us considering because as great as Tailwind v4 is, there are changes that are worth being a little concerned about, at the very, very least, making sure you approach these new features with a bit of caution. A lot of y'all accuse me of being a paid shill for Tailwind. They've never given me a cent, but we do have bills to pay. So before we cover this, let's hear from today's sponsor really fast. Today's sponsor is CodeRabbit, and you're going to wish you set them up earlier because I know I did. I could show you the homepage and all their marketing mumbo jumbo, but I'd rather just show you what it's actually like having an AI bot do code review and summaries and help you with your PR process. I have a bunch of random pull requests open here that we've had CodeRabbit running on, like we do for all of our code at Ping, and it's been really solid. Here's a fun, simple one, and also, this one's on our open source repo, so if you want to go look, you can, and it's free for any open source users, so everything you see here is included in the free tier. You see that it summarized his pull request, it described all the new features being added via this pull request, it called out some bug fixes, as well as all of the test changes that occurred too. And if we scroll down here, we get the best part, the walkthrough. This goes in depth on what specific files changed and what changed about them. This is super handy, especially on big PRs like the one I'm about to show, to have a quick summary for every file on what changed and why. It's just a really quick way to get through. And they even tag in related PRs. So if you have anything going on around the same time, super, super handy. It's been great to work with. It also leaves comments on individual lines that it thinks can be changed. So here it said that it thinks this type could have JS doc on it so that when users see it, it'd be a better type. It even has a one-click button you can press to automatically apply the diff on GitHub. So you don't have to go write the code yourself in your editor. You can just click a button and it applies the changes. And I've been surprised at how many of these changes actually end up being useful. Thank you, CodeRabbit, for sponsoring today's video. Check them out at soydev.link and use code Theo1mfree for your first month for free. The Tailwind CSS v4 beta was just released, and I wanted to share some thoughts on it. More specifically, I have some concerns that I have not seen covered elsewhere. That's what we're here for. Rather than provide any high-level insight, let me address the various changes in Tailwind 4 individually. Disclaimer, these words are my own and do not represent, you get the idea. This is Naman shitposting, giving us awesome free content, and I appreciate him immensely for it. He's also in chat. Thank you for being here. You've probably seen his name pop up in a bunch of videos because he's very quick to correct anything I get wrong about build tools and styling in general. That's good. Anyways, first point, moving to Lightning CSS. The move to Lightning CSS is a good move. The JS community is largely moving to Rust-based tooling, and being on Lightning CSS will help Tailwind easily integrate with various tools. Performance improvements are substantial, but they aren't particularly important. Tailwind JIT was already really fast. The biggest benefit of Lightning is the unification of Tailwind, imports, and syntax lowerings. Not having to manually configure the auto prefixer is a big win. The amount of bullshit with like post CSS and the prefixer and all that, I'm so happy it's gone. CSS first configuration. There is much excitement about the CSS first config. I don't think this is as much of a slam dunk as many others. It has trade-offs. The big benefit is the need for one fewer boilerplate files for getting started. The downside is that most of the config is custom syntax that's specific to Tailwind and is no longer type safe. Hopefully tooling will help bridge that gap. This is a fair point. For a while, this Tailwind config wasn't type safe. We found ways to fix that with type declarations like the JS doc syntax to import the types from the Tailwind config. Then we were able to do it with TypeScript, which was nice. Now we're losing all of those benefits by doing it in CSS. But apparently you can still import the old JS config by importing it with @config the Tailwind config.js file. Didn't know you could do that. That's funny. I might actually end up doing this because I like my type safety. Anyways. Naman calls out this should probably end up being a good move in the long run. I largely agree. CSS theme variables. This is where the concerns start. Architecturally, using real CSS variables is an obvious win. However, in practice, using CSS variables can have some surprising performance pitfalls. Performance issues are inconsistent, and when using a bunch of variables defined on root, the impact seems to be minimal. But when you reassign them or define variables on another element in addition to root, it can have significant performance impacts. If you want proof these problems are somewhat serious, you should check out the last video I did on Tailwind, which was Tailwind broke, but it's not their fault. That video is about how the highlighting on a bunch of websites using Tailwind broke when you drag and select stuff because they styled it with variables, and Chrome, in efforts to make performance better, changed when and how they resolve CSS variables in a way that caused them to break for text highlighting if you nested them in the specific way Tailwind did. The reason that happened is because Chrome wants to improve the performance of these things wherever they can, and they made a shortcut they thought was safe that turned out it wasn't, and they had to revert those changes. They're not doing that because they're evil or they're dumb. They're doing it because they want Chrome to perform well, and these things have performance impacts. Naman does couch this reservation, though. So, as long as most devs don't go overboard with custom scoped overrides for variables, things should be okay. It's also possible to config Tailwind to inline the variable in the CSS output, just like Tailwind 3 and earlier. Most devs configure their themes globally, and scoped overrides for the variables aren't a common use case, so I wonder if inlining variables would have been a better default. Very fair point. Native CSS cascade layers. This is an unmitigated success and an obvious win. My biggest surprise was to learn that this wasn't already the case. There are certain older browsers that don't support cascade layers, but it's a simple polyfill to fix that. This is why we like Naman. This is the @layer rule in CSS. Thank you for the clarification. I would have spent way too long trying to figure that out. Anyways, simplified theme config. A bunch of values that were previously configurable now just allow arbitrary values, like grid calls 73, without the need for 73 to be in brackets. This is a good move, and it removes unnecessary boilerplate and friction. I will take the stance that this is not necessarily an outright win. I'm one of those people that read the book that the Tailwind authors wrote. What was it called again? Refactoring UI. Apparently, they sold a whole bunch of copies of this book when I mentioned it in the past. They've never paid me. They gave it to me for free, which was cool. It's worth a read if you're an engineer that wants to make your design suck a lot less. I learned a lot from this. They wrote it before they'd even made Tailwind. And it's actually kind of fun to read in retrospect because it shows a lot of how Tailwind was made. And one of the decisions they made in this was to limit the options to a compatible set of things like sizes, border sizes, colors, and all those things, but to intentionally limit it, not to a super limited subset, but a meaningfully limited subset. What I liked about the bracket syntax is it made it clear when you were exiting the subset that had already been built into Tailwind. So if you had a size that didn't perfectly fit the scope and the different sizes that existed within Tailwind, you had to indicate that using the brackets. As a compiler feature, as a thing they had to implement, all of that stuff, I don't have a strong opinion on that. What I cared about was the clarity in the things that were using the built-in system versus the things that weren't. And losing that was something I'm not super hyped about. There's a good point from Naman here, which is that for things like the number of columns, that's not part of the design system. But for sizes, colors, etc., this is different. And I totally agree. For columns, this shouldn't have a different syntax if you're using a column number that you didn't prepare for. But for sizes and paddings and all those things, I liked the brackets. There are more obvious wins, though, like automatic source detection, built-in net import support, built-in CSS transpilation, dynamic spacing for scale, P3 colors, container queries, and 3D transformations, which is actually, as you probably saw in my Tailwind 4 video, really cool stuff. I like this call out here. Because the Tailwind docs have all the cool things, you can go there or go to my video. He's going to focus on what he finds controversial. Starting with gradients. Tailwind 4 finally had support for radial and conic gradients. While this is an obvious improvement, I think Tailwind has never handled gradients well. Whew, coming in hot. And I agree. I've actually always been pretty annoyed with the syntax for gradients. It just felt kind of arbitrary. And getting real spicy. It's not something that belongs in the HTML directly. I thought I was going to think about that longer than I did. I agree. These are the points where I'm like, okay, fine, open a CSS file. And to be clear, I know I'm not in the same camp as a lot of the Tailwind fanboys here. Once the Tailwind gets complex like this, once you're making a lot of different conditions or doing a lot of bracketing or crazy animation stuff, just write the CSS in a CSS file. It's fine. Or as Naman calls out in my chat, this is something that should be in the design system, like all of the other tokens. Yes, you should be able to set a gradient as part of your config and then call gradient dash activated or gradient dash brand, not from Indigo 500 via Blue 400 to Teal 300. You should not need these three classes to be copied and pasted, because the copy paste aspect of Tailwind is really, really good when the concerns are within the same file. So if I have like 4 nav links that are hard coded, using the same 7 Tailwind classes for all of those is fine because I can select and replace them all there. A gradient like this is going to be used in a small number of places that are very far away from each other in your code base. I would like it to have a name. It is what it is. Anyways. Also, they use CSS variables to do this under the hood, which is kind of problematic. Tailwind should ship with a set of predefined beautiful gradients that can be used out of the box and let devs define their own gradients in the config file. I agree. Fun fact that I brought up a few times. I spend a lot more time in the Tailwind docs when I'm using a non-Tailwind project because I go to them as a reference for the CSS that I don't feel like writing, so I can copy paste that over to whatever code base I'm working in. And the part I spend the most time in, see if it comes up. Look at that. Second result for most recent, customizing colors. Because I am in this page all of the time just to grab good compatible colors. What if they did this for gradients? What if they gave me some default gradients that looked fine? I would use those all the time. Anyways. And as Naman calls out, this isn't a new problem. It's always been this case, but you can do it in a config file if you want to. Probably should just do that. The new not star and in star variants. Tailwind's added support for not and hover star with the new not and in variants. So now you can say, if not focused, make the background indigo, and in focus, make the opacity for this 100, as long as it's within a focused element. These are good improvements and are good ways to maintain the guarantees of atomic styles. Oh, I thought you might talk some shit on these. Cool. Yeah, good. I liked these a lot. And here's the part that I started getting skeptical of myself, where you could control specific children. I guess you feel similar, Naman. These variants are slightly problematic. They let you use inert and nth child selectors in your class name. This encourages the same bad practice that Atomic CSS in general, and Tailwind in particular, has always discouraged. To be clear, what this means is the thing that made Tailwind and Atomic CSS great is it killed a lot of cascading behaviors where you weren't writing CSS to try and affect the element underneath in very specific, peculiar ways. The element being styled and its styles are a lot closer together when you use Atomic CSS. These rules make it more likely that you're defining the styles outside of the element being affected, which is going to make your CSS harder to maintain almost always. And another good call out from Naman, it makes it less reusable because an element can't be moved somewhere else and expected to behave the same way. It also makes it less clear. Like, let's say you have a parent component that has an nth rule on it, and then the child component is in a different file, styled separately. If you're in that file and you're trying to figure out why this item in a list is being styled weird, and you're in the file with the item from the list, and it just doesn't have that CSS in there at all, it's really confusing. You go to the browser tools, you investigate it, you look at the class names, and you see it's being applied by the parent, you realize you're in the wrong fucking file the whole time. It sucks. It's not fun. And I didn't realize how much time I was losing to those types of things until I moved to Tailwind, and the style was always in the file where the component was. That was a huge win for the maintainability of my code bases. And this steers us away from that in a method that is concerning. Descendant variants. There are many celebrating the destruction of Atomic CSS guarantees, but I think this is probably the most harmful addition to Tailwind ever. Oh boy, coming in hot. Before we do that though, there's a good call out here. Like for the previous one, the odd even use case is a good example of why you would want the nth style rule in the parent here. This is nice because you can have every other child be like darker and lighter for a table and stuff like that. So that's cool. There is no similar justification for the star variant here. The star variant for targeting direct children was already added and it was problematic enough. Here, star colon P4. Now all of these elements get a P4 padding. Again, imagine these elements are coming from a different file and you're trying to figure out where their padding is coming from and it turns out it's here. That sucks. But the double star is way scarier. I like Naman's phrasing here, styling at a distance. This is the enemy of maintainable styles. If the style is too far away from the element it's affecting, it makes fixing things that are wrong way harder. And as he says here, at least with the star, it was contained and limited to direct children. The double star variant ruins that completely. Now we have double star colon data-avatar colon rounded full. Now any sub-element anywhere below this div, if it applies data avatar, it's going to magically get this style. For you CSS diehards that have been doing this stuff your whole life, you might be like, yeah, that's how CSS works. For the people who live in Tailwind, you might see why this is weird and scary. You apply your styles by applying your styles. And realistically speaking, if you have the type of control to apply data avatar here, you also have the control to put rounded full on it. There's no reason you should abstract that up here other than to be a good CSS cascading citizen. And I just don't think this is good. As Naman says, other see power, I see chaos. Tailwind has finally jumped the shark and added essentially all of CSS into class names. This is no longer atomic CSS. Whew. Bars out here. This is no longer atomic CSS, and developers will abuse the hell out of this and run into all the terrible problems that Tailwind was saving them from in the first place. There is still time. This feature should be rolled back before it's too late. Whew. Bold. Do I think this should be rolled back? Okay. Here's my middle ground take on this. The cases where I see this being useful are cases where you can't control the sub-elements. Like if you're loading data from a CMS or something that is HTML. In those cases, those very specific cases, this could be very useful. Because it is such a specific case, I think this should be hidden under a flag, similar to like dangerous set inner HTML. Because funny enough, the case I was just describing, like HTML coming from a CMS, you have to dangerously set inner HTML there anyways. So if this was dangerously target all sub-elements, then I could see this being okay to leave in. But this just being there as part of the default Tailwind experience is going to result in people thinking that doing this is just as safe as doing this, which is just as safe as putting P4 on all of the LIs yourself. If there is no clarity as you're using it, that this is something to be cautious of, then it will be used by default the same way all of CSS's shit defaults are used already. And part of why Tailwind is great is it keeps away some of those features in CSS that make your code way harder to maintain. But if Tailwind adds in enough of CSS, you'll end up in the same place. So I fundamentally disagree with this message, Azores. It's a feature like add apply. Some people use it, some don't. The difference there is that add apply isn't one of the Tailwind class names. It is a feature that in a different file for a different use case enables you to write Tailwind a certain way. There is some clarity, admittedly not enough, but there is some clarity that add apply is not part of the default core Tailwind experience because it's not in the place that you're writing it. It's not where you're writing these class names in your code. It's somewhere else. And it's, I think, become clear enough to the community that add apply is not recommended. And on top of all of that, the Tailwind team has directly expressed that they regret adding add apply to Tailwind. So the only part I agree on here is that it is like add apply. They shouldn't have added it, or at the very least, they should have put it under a config that makes it clear as hell that you're doing something dangerous. Is another good point from YouTube chat. Rare, but nice to see. This is dangerous, especially for people who are new to Tailwind that are coming from CSS. They're just going to repeat the patterns that they're used to instead of embracing one of the core points of Tailwind. Fully agree. Naman called out here that he sees this elsewhere. I think Adam knows better, but he got bullied by the community, and in this case, the community is wrong. One of the things that I think made Tailwind so great is that it ignored the community. If Tailwind listened to the haters and the people saying it should do things differently or not exist, Tailwind just wouldn't exist. If you listen to the pushback on your strong opinions, you don't make Tailwind. I think some of those opinions were worth walking back, like adding the bracket syntax was a huge win in so many ways, even if I don't love it most of the time. The double star is just kind of dangerous. There are more things here, and this is nice because these are the things that I've wanted to talk about from Naman's short, pointed critique of Tailwind that I haven't had a chance to, and now I finally can. The class names could be better. This callout blew my mind when he first told me about it. Tailwind usually has a prefix in the class name to suggest the style being applied. So BG Red 500, the BG means background color. M-SM is for margin, PT is for padding top, etc. But there are certain class names where that's not the case, like flex and grid, and even something like text, which can apply a color or a font size. In recent versions, this has become even more common with grow and shrink replacing flex grow and flex shrink respectively. When I saw this, I knew you were going to do something, Naman, because I remember this conversation. And when I saw this change, I was like, oh, they're going backwards, not forwards here. You might be confused. Why does this matter? Why do we not like this? These changes are good for brevity, but they do introduce confusion and they can have a significant impact on code size. But the biggest part is the runtime cost. If you use a tool like Tailwind Merge and you have, let's say, a button that has default things in it, like you have a default background color for your button, but somebody can override it. Because of how CSS works, the order you apply class names doesn't matter. I have these two elements in HTML. Div class name AB, height, div class name BA, height 2. If I add a background color, blue, they both become blue. What happens if I add background color red? I'd fix that. They both become red because CSS doesn't give a shit what order you apply the class names on the element. All it cares about is the order that they exist in the CSS. This sucks. So let's say you have a component that's button class B, but you want the user to be able to override this and give it a different background color. If the background color they give occurs earlier in the CSS, it doesn't work. You can't just add new class names. You have to be careful and make sure you remove B if you want to apply A. If we did this way with these prefixes, and I passed BGA to this component, I could quickly check and see if any other things have the same prefix, and if they do, I can remove them so that I don't have to deal with this conflict. But what if they were named flex and grid? Now I have to have a custom path that makes sure if I'm applying grid that none of the other things that conflict with it are applied to the element. You can't do a simple prefix check. You have to do a lot more work. And the result is that things like Tailwind Merge are slower than they should have to be. Funny enough, the Tailwind team actually tends to discourage Tailwind Merge, and they expect all styles to be applied statically. But that's not realistic. Like, almost all of the biggest uses for Tailwind are using Tailwind Merge. It looks like over a third of Tailwind projects are using Tailwind Merge. You can't pretend it doesn't matter. And that is a very good call out. Their solution is to not merge classes and manage conflicts with important calls. It's to style things based on data or ARIA attributes and just handle everything declaratively with CSS. I do not like this solution. This makes your components way less reusable, and it hurts. Another good call out from Naman is that not everything uses Tailwind Merge. A lot use class names or CLSX or CN instead, and they end up dealing with inconsistency a bunch when they develop. And obviously, both Naman and I fundamentally disagree with that approach. Not only does it bloat the amount of CSS, it makes the logic parts of your component less reusable because the styles get too closely baked in. Yeah, native Tailwind Merge and class variance authority would have been a better addition for V4 than the double star. I totally agree. I'm going to drop a real hot take right now. A lot of Tailwind's success comes from the fact that components in React don't have a good style solution by default. There is no good way to style things within React. But the component model was so powerful that we went with it anyways. We invented a bunch of different ways within the React ecosystem to do styling that varied in their quality. But Tailwind as a modern atomic CSS solution gave us a really happy path for component-based styling without having to leave the React component model. React is inarguably a huge part of why Tailwind was successful. I don't think the Tailwind team would disagree. If they do, hit me up. I'm down to chat. But there's another important detail here. The Tailwind team doesn't like React. The Tailwind team are very PHP and Rails pilled. They come from those worlds. A lot of their stuff is still using that. They don't love this way of doing things. React is a huge part of why Tailwind's successful, but React is not a thing that Tailwind wants to concern themselves with if they don't have to. Because of that, things that are really reliant on like client JS and client interactions tend to be less the priority of the Tailwind team. In some ways, it's the same reason they're moving to CSS for config instead of JS. They don't want to be a JS library. NPM is just the best distribution method for what they're doing and what their goals are. They don't want to think about client-side JavaScript at all. They don't like it. And that's fine. I get it. I understand it. But yeah, I like this point from Naman. Tailwind merge doesn't make sense to be part of Tailwind because Tailwind is language agnostic. Tailwind merge needs to be implemented for each language because it's a runtime function. To be fair, the language is JavaScript, but yeah. And if you end up using their way of doing things too much, the CSS will bloat and that will affect performance. Absolutely agree. Yeah. Hopefully that helps clarify why these prefixes would be very helpful. In Naman's words, I think Tailwind should make it easier for tools such as Tailwind merge to exist and be as performant as possible. As a side effect, it might also make the styles easier and more consistent to read and work with. I agree. And finally, we have the rampant usage of rem units. It's easy to change the defaults in Tailwind, but the default theme uses rem units for absolutely everything, from font size to spacing and from sizing to media queries. Designers love this as it lets them maintain their previous proportions, but this is actually an accessibility anti-pattern. When browsing a website, the user is able to control sizing in two ways. This is really important. I only learned about this by talking with Naman. You can do page zoom, which I do all the time, but you can also change the default font size. When I learned this, I knew this already, but I hadn't thought about it for a while. When I relearned this, I was really excited because I like big fonts, especially when I'm reading stuff for content. So I went and I changed the default font size in my browser to be large. And it broke so much shit because rem is based on the default font size. So if you change your font size, it changes everything. As Naman says here, it basically just changes font size to be a different way of zooming, instead of it being just the controlling of how big your font is. This is user hostile, and it forces you to perhaps need slightly larger text to be able to read comfortably in order to be forced into a layout mode for smaller screens with less density. Yep, totally agree. The default value for spacing, sizing, and media queries should all be using pixel values and not rem, which should only be used for font size. Yeah. Hopefully, you guys are seeing why I like Naman's takes. He's not saying Tailwind is bad. He's actually shilling the best parts, but is calling out how some of those parts are being damaged by specific decisions, as well as the costs of previous decisions that don't seem like a big deal until you think about this deep enough. Apparently, there are cases where height should still use rem, especially if it's like height for a container that has a font in it, because the height needs to match the height of the text. Totally agree. Rare cases that should have their own, like if it was HF, like height for font, or HT height text or something like that, like if they had a height thing specific for that, that was rem, everyone's happy. So let's hear the conclusion. While this post happened to focus on the negatives, that's only because the positives are so obvious that there isn't much to say. I'm very much nitpicking here, but given the massive popularity of Tailwind, I think it's important to provide constructive criticism and to help improve the tool for the entire community. On my end, Tailwind to StyleX has already been upgraded to use Tailwind v4 behind the scenes, and I'm excited to take it even further and more feature-rich. Tailwind to StyleX, by the way, probably deserves a video of its own. It's a really cool project that lets you take your class names from Tailwind, and then a compiler, because StyleX is a compiler, rips those out and makes the most optimal set of classes through StyleX. Really, really cool stuff, and I am more than happy to plug this because this article was great, Naman is great, StyleX is great. Hopefully you all learned something from this one. I am hyped to finally get to cover these very real, admittedly small, but super valid negatives of Tailwind. And now that there's a bigger, scarier one with V4, it's more important than ever that we're considerate of these things as we use, adopt, and evangelize the best way to do CSS for most people right now, kind of. It is what it is. I love Tailwind. You guys know that. StyleX is cool. Hopefully you guys know that. Tailwind V4 is great for the most part. Be careful with the double stars. Until next time, peace, nerds.